how it all started for me and my education that followed is a fairly long story. I'll try to say it fast, though, or go through it fast, but it's interesting and, of course, super meaningful to me. When I was a junior in high school, I contracted a illness, possibly called a disease that was, they thought it was rheumatic fever at the time. And I was put in the hospital, bedridden for 3 months, and then sent home for 3 more months bedridden. And I could go to the bathroom once a day, otherwise use the urinal. But at the hospital, I never went into a bathroom for 3 months. Um, many years later, I had a similar illness again, and it was diagnosed as Reiter's syndrome, Reiters. And so that doctor thought that I was misdiagnosed when I was in high school. In any event, they kept me down like that to protect my heart, even though they didn't know I was misdiagnosed. But anyway, so I had a homebound teacher who came to my house when I was in bed, and I was able to take a couple of classes, maybe 3 classes with her, but I couldn't take the full load I would have taken if I was a junior in high school. So when I went back my senior year, I had to load up. I didn't have a study hall. I didn't have any electives. I had to take all, as we call them, solids or academics. And I wasn't a great student. And I was doing okay. But I felt kind of overburdened with all the homework and stuff. So I found out, having talked to a counselor, that I could graduate from a Nevada State high school, and this is in Reno, Nevada, where I was born and raised, that I could graduate as a senior without an algebra class, an advanced algebra class. So I dropped that class about 6 weeks or 8 weeks into the new fall semester of my senior year, and took a crafts class that friends of mine told me if I did, all I had to do was hang out, mess around, and I'd get an A or a B or whatever, and there was just nothing to it. So that's why I took it, just to ease my burden, and I had no aspirations of being involved in anything in that class other than what I had to do to look okay. So I got there, and the class is 50 minutes long. I walked across campus. I probably checked in with him with my little chit, my transfer chit, maybe 10 minutes after the class started. And it was a very busy room, square room, had lots of craft, kind of, like weaving and enameling and this and that. And it had one corner for clay that nobody was at or using. And so he looked around, he said, I'm going to take you over here. So he took me over there where no other students were, and he grabbed a bag of clay, a rolling pin, said, make a slab built pitcher. And he walked away and went back to attend to the rest of the class. And I had never made anything out of clay. And by the end of that remaining 40 minutes or whatever, I had built a coffee pot scale decanter that was kind of truncated in design and had a spout on the side, more like a coffee pot spout, a lid with a handle, and a side stick-like handle that was kind of Scandinavian influence. And all the parts kind of reiterated the main form. And I did that all in 40 minutes, and it just kind of came to me. It was not a struggle. And I was so in love with that thing. I cannot tell you. And I'm like looking around when the bell rang to go to my next class. I'm thinking, where can I put this so no one will harm it? So I looked up. There's a cabinet on a wall above a high counter. I got on a chair, got on the counter, lifted the piece up on a bat, put it up on top of that cabinet, and put a plastic bag over it. The rest of the day, in between every class, I sprinted to that craft class, got up there, lifted the bag off, and just admired my piece. And actually took an elephant ear sponge up there too and kind of stroked it with a damp sponge. I mean, I was absolutely in love with the experience of having made that and the result. And as it turned out, I got fired. I glazed it. It turned out beautiful. My teacher put it in a showroom in a hallway. And I was a good student. I liked school. I was social. I was part of, kind of cool people and all that, but I wasn't an athlete. I never was on the speech club. I don't know, I always worked after school. And so this was kind of the first time I excelled at something, um, and more so than anybody around me. Not that anybody was doing that there. Um, my teacher got so enthused over my enthusiasm that he became very supportive. And I started a club called the Potters Club, and told a bunch of friends how much fun it was to make pottery, and that we would gather night every week after school until about 11 o'clock and work. And then we had a pottery sale that had never happened before, that I instigated. And then they created a new award at the end of the year for the award assembly called Craftsman of the Year, and I got that. And all those things were like so foreign to me in a way. Um, but fundamentally, I was absolutely, it was life changing. I mean, I was just so in love with it. So anyway, my teacher started talking to me about going to art school, and I had never even considered leaving the state or doing something like that. So at first it just seemed impossible to me. But by the end of the year, he had talked me into going to California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland, where he had graduated from. Funny thing is, he was only about 6 years older than I am. I was then. So he was young, and we related very well to him. Um, so anyway, that's how it started for me. So off I went to art school. I was actually on probation for the first couple semesters because my grade point average from high school was kind of low. And then I, got into carrying full credits every semester. And, I was just as smitten and in love, and passionate about ceramics at CCAC as I was when I left school. But
I
now I was being faced with taking every other kind of art class known to man, which I'd never taken, life drawing and color class and art histories. And, it was a very, very full spectrum of foundation classes, design, lettering, all kinds of things. And so all that was very new to me, but I adapted. It took me a little while because it was very intimidating. And then I earned, not to pat myself in the back, but I earned scholarships and graduated, whatever, with honors, et cetera. But so I got my BFA degree at California College of Arts and Crafts. And then I was drafted in the Vietnam wartime. And I spent 2 years in the military. And after that, I wanted to go to grad school, but I really, emotionally, I wasn't ready. So I moved to the country and tried to be a potter for a while. And I did that for about a year and a half. And I realized that although I had that capability, and in fact, up to that point, my work was largely centered around making vessels, learning how to be very skillful at the wheel and glaze calculation, all that kind of stuff. Um, but I did find that the day in, day out life of a potter, even a studio potter, not a production potter, just wasn't for me. So I went back to painting houses to make money, and which I was also doing at that time anyway. But and then I worked on my work for a year and a half or so, and it all became non-vessel related, just object making, call it sculpture, but it was object scale. And I applied for graduate school at University of California at Davis, and I got in, and I spent 2 years there and earned an MFA degree soon after that, which was a great experience. It's a great experience. Bob Arneson was the ceramics professor. His studio was right across the hall from mine. I graduated in 1975, and I was lucky to get a professorship at California State University that following fall, 1975. And I taught there for 34 years and retired about 8 or 9, 10 years. I've lost track now, about 10 years ago. When I was at CCAC, the professor was a man named Vernon Kuykendall. And he he was an interesting guy. He was a wonderful man. He was probably in his 60s, mid 60s at that time. So he seemed pretty old. He never worked. I never ever saw him even do a demonstration, and he didn't do any personal work. It's like, I don't know. He stopped doing that at some point. So he wasn't. He wasn't a great mentor in that sense, but he would come by and give us technical advice in terms of how to hold your hands throwing a pot, or how to finish a lip, or this or that, and sometimes talk about design. But he was kind of clearly even out of his element if he had to talk very much about ideas, or more complicated issues about proportion and weight, and all the kinds of things that make a pot beautiful and wholesome. But he was supportive, and he was a great guy. So he was the professor. In that same room every day was another person named Viola Fry, who everybody knows about. She's incredibly famous. And Viola was what was termed a resident potter. She was given that name by Vernon Kuykendall, Professor Kuykendall, so that she could be there and have a little space in the corner, a little studio space. It was open, you could watch her work. And she had been a student of his. This is kind of a long story, but she was a student of his at that school. And then he got fired because he was gay. And this is a long time ago. This is in the 60s, maybe in the late 50s, actually. And so he left and went and taught at Tulane. Viola and he got along so well that she followed him to New Orleans, and she got her MFA at Tulane. And then she went up and interfaced with ceramic industry in New Jersey for a year or two. And then, funny enough, California College of Arts and Crafts, feeling they might have made a mistake or they're too harsh, hired him back. And he went back to California, and Viola followed him. Now, they both lived over in San Francisco. She didn't drive at all. And in the morning, he would pick her up because she lived quite nearby him. And she would get in his car. They would arrive at California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland at 8 o'clock in the morning. And she would go in the studio and start working. And she would work until noon and then walk down to Broadway, the major street in front of the school, and get on a bus and go all the way back to San Francisco and go to work for Macy's in the accounting department. And then she did that until 11 o'clock at night or whatever time it was. It's kind of a swing shift. And then next day she'd come back with Vernon or Professor Kuykendall. So eventually Kuykendall retired and Viola was hired and in his position, but that was 2 or 3 years after I had graduated. So a lot of people think Viola was one of my teachers, but she never was. Sometimes she walked by and she would mumble some stuff, a little this, a little that about work, some opinions, but not too much. But the great thing was that we watched her work. And at that time, she was mandated by Professor Kuykendall, as we all were in that department, to only make pottery. It always had to be a vessel. You could not make sculpture. He didn't want us competing with the sculpture department, and he didn't want sculptors coming over to the clay department to make sculpture out of clay and utilizing the resources. So she made vessel-based objects that were often adorned with figures on the surface and reliefs and big giant casserole casks, kind of with kind of Etruscan imagery on the top. I mean, not Etruscan, but Etruscan-like. And her work was always, strong and powerful. And it wasn't until Vernon, she taught summer school one summer before he retired. And she actually made sculptures the first time because he wasn't around to notice. And as soon as she got that job, she started making the figuration, the grandmas or the women, the kind of self-portraits that we all know. And of course, ultimately, all that followed. So that's who taught at CCAC. And at Davis, Bob Arneson I mean, in grad school, you take independent study from just about everybody in the faculty, and there was luminaries in that faculty. There's Wayne Thiebaud, Manuel Neri, um, Roy DeForest, Bob Arneson, William T. Wiley, who just died. And in fact, I was just reading an article here out in Minnesota at my friend's house about William T. Wiley, which was from the New York Times. So we took independent studies from all those people. And of course, I took it from Robert Arneson as well. Robert Arneson was a difficult person for me in that um, in 2 years, I don't know. I don't know if he ever said he liked anything I made or really encouraging. Um, I came to believe that his tactic was to be like. In fact, he was a football coach in high school before he went back, got a master's degree at Mills College, and then got the job at Davis ultimately. But I kind of think that his idea was to challenge a student, not give them too much love or very little at all, and have them realize that the only way that you can really make it as an artist is, not only working hard but believing in yourself, and it's kind of a self-fulfilled thing. And so anyway, it was kind of tough. And a lot of times he would come in the studio and he would say something to me that when he left, I thought, oh, that meant a certain thing about how I should think about this work I have that he just saw. That's what that meant. And so sometimes I would begin to adjust that work some. So the next time he came in, he'd say something quite the opposite. And I said, yeah, but you just said the other day that such and such. And he said, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. And he would refute that. So I don't know. I got to thinking he was a little bit like um, a Zen priest throwing out koans, unanswerable kind of questions. And but of course, it was fantastic to be around watching him work for those 2 years, and his habits in the studio, and also being able to work with all the other faculty who were truly incredible artists. That was a very powerful period at UC Davis for about a 20-year period. Well, when I got into graduate school, I got in based on a lot of small ceramic objects that don't really know how to typify them, and don't need to be specific. But when I got to Davis, um, I had not a mandate, but I had a desire to make things that were large scale, and things that I had never ever made before. I just wanted to kind of go somewhere that was really, really fresh and new and be very explorative. And I spent the first year making all kinds of things that didn't really lead to any continuation. And it was toward the end of that year that I made. I always built large vessels, but this is long before Davis. When I hand built, I did a coil and pinch method. So just rolling clay out into a coil. There was a point where I actually allowed a coil to harden, and then I was raccooing these kind of sticks of clay, and I just liked them as an element, a stick of clay. And one day I took some of those sticks and I began to attach them together and make grids out of them, kind of loosely formed, reticulated grids. And I found quite satisfying. So I continued in that mode. And so the whole second year I built very, very large scale pieces utilizing multiple grids. Some basically they were 2 feet by 2 feet by 1 foot deep. And one piece I made in particular had 50 of those in it. And everybody made a connection with Saul LeWitt and the minimalists of that time. And I was aware of their work, and I'm not sure I was emotionally moved by their work, but I always liked things that are structures, the underpinnings of bridges and things like that. So In any event, that's what I did. My graduate show was a very large gallery filled up with really large pieces. A lot of them are 8 feet by 8 feet by more, and the one with 50 units in it. I have a picture of it where it's 24 feet wide by 12 feet tall. Um, so anyway, the work was abstract. And the weird thing was, though, that I did a lot of drawing. I had so much drawing as an undergraduate and life drawing that I loved drawing from a model. So when I was at Davis, I would go to a private modeling class at nighttime with other fellow students and draw the figure. And I really enjoyed that. I liked the results, of course, sometimes. But then I go back to the studio and work in a very abstract fashion. And I was kind of bothered by that because I just felt like there was this sort of split, and I didn't quite get it. And then I would try to venture into a little figuration now and then, and it just wasn't, I couldn't find my place in it somehow. And at the same time, the work that I did at Davis, I was like really proud of what I'd done, but it kind of felt like art with quotation marks, like it still wasn't really mine or something in a deeper way. So I left graduate school. I got the job teaching at Sacramento State University. I was living in a house up in the country, and I would come back from teaching all day long. Of course, I only taught 2 days a week, but I had a little studio there with a potbelly stove in there, and I would like start the fire to keep me warm. And it was a very small studio, like 12 by 12. And I made some little figures one night, and I literally fired them. I made them, and as soon as I finished fashioning them, I would throw them into the coals of the fire, which you can do if the clay's really wet. It'll steam and not blow up. And 2 hours later, I was putting them on some little sticks, sliding them back on these armatures, and then painting them with house paint. And it was a really freeing experience, and they were kind of small, totemic, primitive, possibly, definitely related to kind of Day of the Dead stuff. And I had lived in Mexico in 1968 for 6 months. So there was that influence. And there was just something about that work that, as simple and quick as it was and small scale, that really reached out to me. So I began at that point making figurative sculpture. And then I moved to Sacramento and bought a building with a large studio. So I was not limited in scale. And pretty much it was all figurative. However, after about 5 years of that and making life-size clay figures, I had a desire to make abstract pieces, again, related to the stuff in graduate school, but more objective as a thing, so that they actually were kind of symbolic of certain things instead of fully abstract or non-representational. And I did that, and I did a whole series of them, really large. I had a big show at the Bronstein Gallery, and every one of them sold, and then I didn't do them. And then I continued with the figure, and to this day, I have punctuated an interest, which is more often than not with the figure, with abstract work. And I would call it most of the time an evocative abstraction. It's not full abstraction where there's no sense of what the source was. It's evocative in that I think anybody looking at it would surmise it to be something because it does come from something. And of course, all abstraction should. If it doesn't, then it's just decorative, period. So I say that because when I do these series of abstract works, people aren't very interested in that work, particularly collectors. Collectors always want something that typifies the nature of a person's work. You want a Richard Shaw, you want it to look like a Richard Shaw. Problem with it for an artist is sometimes you want to change, and the work that you're doing seems just as meaningful or more so than other work that people associate with you, and they're not interested in it, and it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing. So anyway, and I continue to do that to this point. And in other words, lapse back into abstraction. And in fact, the language series that are in the exhibit, which maybe we'll get to in a little bit under a different question, are an example of that. In regards to influence and early influence, I would definitely credit the influence and kind of power of Bay Area figuration, which was, largely painting, some sculpture, and its impact on probably all artists in the Bay Area and Northern California, period. Without a doubt. As far as the funk art movement, people regard it as funk artists. I've never felt a kinship with that kind of work. I've had an appreciation for it, but I actually went to a show at UC Berkeley that was called the Funk Show, and it was a really big show mounted by Peter Seltz, great curator and director of the Berkeley Art Museum. And so that was pretty seminal exhibit. But in general, no, like Bob Arneson is related to funk, Roy DeForest, and, again, I admire their work, but that kind of work just never touched me. I think starting out as a potter and wanting to make a good, wholesome pot with a beautiful trim foot and all the things that make a piece of pottery, at least in my estimation, an incredible object. As that led, and I went away from that for the most part, although returned in the last 20 years to making pottery. When it came to sculpture, I was more interested in work inspirationally that had to do with material. And for instance, Peter Volkas and the abstract expressionist clay movement, those kind of people interested me, but not the funk stuff. But definitely the figuration, it's just part of the landscape of Northern California. And all the while in New York, it was abstraction. So definitely that influenced me. I was a professor for a long time, and I know how some of my colleagues do not like the word intuition when students talk about, oh, it was my intuition, that caused me to make this or whatever. They think that's kind of a weakness and a cop out. But for me, my work is highly intuitive, and I believe as much in a kind of an intuitive intelligence or an innate intelligence, the intelligence of subconscious, to be every bit as powerful as an intellectual kind of construct. And in fact, it's probably more truthful. And so my work kind of comes to me like any idea would come to anybody, and if it feels compelling enough and powerful enough, I act on it. And I've always said that, I use kind of an old gunslinger's term, and that is I shoot first and ask questions later. I believe that one of the biggest harms that we can do to ourselves as an artist is to talk ourselves out of a desire that we have. Let's just, for instance, say that you're a painter and you've been painting 3x3 canvases, and all of a sudden you want to do 9x12 canvases. And you're painting your little canvas year after year, whatever, in comfort zone. And you think about that big canvas, and then you say, yeah, but God, it's hard to build stretcher bars that big. And gosh, it's expensive to buy the canvas. And oh man, and then where would I store them? I mean, if I have 10 of them, like, oh my God. So pretty soon you talk yourself out of it. You don't do it. And you go on living, wishing for something else. And it could be even, a non-artist in life wanting a boat or a Corvette or something like that, and never allowing themselves to have it. So the Corvette, who cares? But as an artist, if you don't follow um, that need or that desire, that call, you're cutting into the potential for a much more idiosyncratic or personalized expression that will differentiate your work from someone else's work. At least it has that potential. And if nothing else, the experience, giving it to yourself, giving yourself permission is super important. And along with that goes giving up fear. Um, Fear, and an aspect of fear. So we can talk ourselves out of, we cut into ourselves. And I try not to ever cut into myself. I try to support that notion only if it's powerful enough to move on. And then I try to learn from it afterwards. And I am surely critical of the work and very thoughtful about what's good in it, what's not good in it, how it could be better, what does it mean, blah blah blah, all that kind of thing. So I begin a more intellectual process after the fact, and that's how I work. And I also I have noticed that over time that the more I think about something and make it kind of according to a plan or design, the more stilted it is, and the less soul it has. I'm
So,
better. I'm better at birthing um, than nurturing something along forever. There's no way to embed something like that. It'd be like uh, listening to somebody sing a song that brings tears to your eyes or makes your heart, you feel it in your body. It's just so powerful, and it's such a great gift to hear that person singing that song. They're not trying to put that in. I mean, of course they're trying to give all of themselves, but in that process they're giving it, they're sharing it, they're emoting it, and but they're not plugging it in and like, okay, in this next line I'm going to really let them. I don't know. It's just it's an ability um, to imbue something with a bit of magic and spirit. And if I say some people have it and some people don't, that's really not a nice thing to say. But everybody has a sensibility, um, and the sensibility helps generate different kinds of visual experience ultimately in an artwork. And um, I don't know how to say. I don't try to do anything in any conscious way when I make my pieces that would further the experience for the viewer to experience a greater amount of emotion, or a certain kind of emotion, or a sense of the spiritual, or kind of a magical thing. I don't do any of that consciously at all. But I mean, I think um, I have a relationship with the material, and the process of bringing it forth and giving it form, and building this thing into a finality, is a kind of a loving experience. And I don't know. I just think I'm going to stop that for 1 second and just kind of relate. You mentioned the Mexican Mass. I mean, I think of people like the sculptor Manzu or Marino Marini. Many times they're European sculptors, Giacometti, people who they had a touch, and when they handled material, every little square inch of the piece has resonance, has presence, and um, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's like poetry, constant um, poetry, and it's not the same all through one piece. And um, so surface and texture and innuendo and all those kinds of little refrains or little passages in a piece are incredibly important to me. And and kind of discovering them and then encourage them along as I make the work. Now, I usually I always start with an idea, but as I begin to make the piece, I allow flexibility. And I notice that if I try to browbeat this material with my tools into the idea that I have a sketch of, a literal sketch of, it will not succeed in the best possible way. However, if I proceed with an idea, and then pretty soon the process and the material itself and the involvement with the tools, there's a conversation going on, and they're beginning to lead me or say, hey, you know what? Your idea was okay, but I think you ought to kind of swing around this way a little bit because this would be better. Because all of a sudden I'll see an opportunity, and it's like this conversation that's occurring, and it can happen. It happens when the ego is not overpowering the other constituents, meaning the material, the process, time, and the now. And so I always learn something greater than what I knew during the making. Now that's not to say I do that with every piece. I can't be there in a really deep, connected way with every piece. I make a lot of crap. I mean, I've made a lot of bad stuff, and a lot of times I will follow an idea that I probably shouldn't have followed and waste my time for more than one piece, even. So it doesn't all turn out wonderful for me at all. I mean, God, I wish it did. And the older I get, the less I can stand losing or failing. However, that is part of the process. It's just part of the deal. A lot of times people do ask me how I shift from clay to wood and when and why, etc. There's nothing very profound about that. Clay has, as you know, a beauty about it. It's plastic. It's probably the only substance on the earth that's plastic and malleable. And once left alone and of course fired, records that energy that was perpetrated on it, against it, whatever fingerprints to dents to tears, etc. And that's an incredible thing. And just the feeling of clay in the hands is like there's just nothing like it. And so I like to work with clay sometimes, but then clay is a very difficult medium, as you well know. It may be the most difficult medium there is for any artist to work with. It shrinks, it cracks, it explodes, it warps, there's a whole bunch of other technical terms it does. And with surfaces and glazes, they blister, they crawl, so many things. And when you're making a ceramic piece, particularly a large scale piece, you've got to baby that thing along like a child all the way through the process. If it gets too dried out, that's not good. You can't continue on. If it's too wet, you can't go forward. If it gets too wet, it might collapse under the plastic you've covered to protect it from getting too dry. It's just on and on and on. And the larger the scale with clay, it's exponentially more difficult to achieve everything about it, including the firing. You need large kilns. So there are points where I just kind of go, you know what, like I'm tired of clay now, and I'm going to grab some wood. And how I started working with wood is quite by accident. But once I discovered wood, what I loved about it was I could leave at the end of the day, or at any moment. If my kids called me and I had to go to them, I could drop my tools, leave my wooden device or on the work table, walk away. I could come back a year later, a month later, a day later, whatever, and resume. There's nothing to fear. And the only time I ever had to wait to progress through a piece is for glue joints to dry. And sometimes that can be as little as an hour, hour and a half. So it's very satisfying. You can start work all day long and not have to quit. And clay is just not like that at all, unless you're talking about small pots that you're throwing and then later on coming back to. You can keep throwing all day long. But um, so there's a lot of satisfaction that I get from wood, and it allows me to do things in terms of um, presentation of a figure. They can be on one foot, cantilevering through the air, all kinds of things that I couldn't do with clay. Um, so I like that about it. It also is a very warm substance. It's not that unlike clay in that it's very human, and it receives texture incredibly well, somewhat like clay, but nothing like clay. In general, the only reason I use drawing at all to build sculpture or possibly even make pots, build sculpture out of wood or clay, and rarely would I do it for pottery, but sometimes is to do a simple sketch that kind of captures a gesture that has to be, particularly in clay, that has to be, I have to be mindful of because of gravitational forces. And also, whether it's wood or clay, I need to know um, the scale of it, roughly. Um, if it's 5 feet tall, I spend a lot of time thinking about the proportions of pieces. And I played with, I'm going to go backwards here a little bit, but I played with proportions as a um, abstract tool over the years with my figuration in every which way you can imagine, by having shorter legs than what's normal and a longer torso, therefore, or shorter torso and longer legs. And it just goes on and on. Longer arms, shorter arms, large. I don't ever do large heads, but very diminutive heads, and play with those kind of proportions. But anyway, the sketches help me just get started and know that I've got to glue the wood up a certain size to get going for this idea. Then once I get going on it, as I said before, things can vary from um, my idea. And now those drawings are not super specific at all. They just capture scale and gesture. That is all. They're otherwise they don't have to do with the idea generation at all. And then drawing, though, is incredibly important to me, and I had so much of it in college that it became kind of part of my my art self, and I do it for its own sake. And you will have, what, I don't know, 3 or 4 examples of two-dimensional work in the show. And most every year I have spent a period of time doing two-dimensional work, ultimately to be framed and shown alongside my other work, whether it's clay or wood. Um, so I think that's my answer. I made a piece about, God, it's embarrassing sometimes when I realize that I go back in time and readdress something. It seems kind of so retrograde or whatever. But for some reason, about a year ago, when I was out here in Minnesota and getting ready to head back to California, I was thinking about 2 or 3 pieces I made way back in, probably, what would that have been, like the late 80s. And I had built these ceramic volumes that referred to the figure. One in particular was the image of a figure in silhouette doing meditation called zazen in Zen meditation. And then I clad it in ceramic tiles that I made and broke up and clad it, and it was pretty beautiful. I did 2 or 3 pieces like that. I mean, they just always held well for me even after all these years. And when I went back this last fall to California, I embarked on making a bunch of those kinds of things, and I just really got into it and enjoying it. So I did them in ways that I'd never done them before, and I knew that the whole time I'm making them, I'm thinking, I mean, I always think about the weakness of certain kinds of formats or ideas. And I always have people's, going back to fears, we all have, us art students and even grown up artists, we have these voices in the back of our mind of our teachers who didn't like this or didn't like that, and we know what they would say about it, or even formally they would have a lot of criticism that seems to be, solid philosophy about art, to give about certain kinds of ideas. I'm getting kind of clumsy with my speech here, but so just the notion of mosaic to start with, the associations are with Sunday craft people. You get a wine bottle and you cover with mosaic, and now you've got a cute little vase, I guess. And I mean, and then mosaic is something children do. Mosaic is something that the Romans did, and of course, incredibly so. Um, that's a different level of mosaic, but murals, um, but they're never quite put on the same. None of that is put on. It's always a very craft level connection. So just doing it, I thought, well, people are going to think this is pretty crafty, pretty funky, crafty in a bad way. But like Lucas Samara said one time, when you want to do something, it doesn't matter whether someone else has done it, doesn't matter what it relates to, whatever it's strong enough, you do it. You just do it. So anyway, I threw those worries out. And I played with it in a lot of different ways, or quite a few different ways. But they were all those pieces are, I think, are they? Oh, well, they're all objective. Some of them are figurative. Some of them are at least objective. They're referring to something. As far as the language series goes, if I can jump over to that, I've done those. I've ceased in the last year and a half, 2 years now, but I did those for 10 years. And a lot of times, series of my work, even in wood, I mean, an actual series that's connected, that has kinship from one piece to another. Sometimes they don't exceed but a few pieces, or six or seven, or whatever. And sometimes they go way beyond that. But I have made, I don't even know, countless amounts of language series pieces. And the very first ones I made were large. They were almost 40 inches square. I mean, that's pretty large to pick them up and not break them, getting them into the kiln. But let me tell you what my notion was. Well, first of all, fundamentally, they relate to the work I did in graduate school, the structural kind of work, and then later to revisit it again, with a with a different kind of format, objective formats, but still structural information. And over the years, even some figures were held up by structures. LA County Museum has a piece that you might remember, Joe, that has kind of a boat form and structure underneath the figure. So that's been a persisting interest of mine. But I have always, I have always appreciated and loved symbols and glyphs, and the things that are kind of enigmas but seem to have weight and measure and meaning, but we don't understand what they are. And I've always appreciated kanji, Japanese language, and symbols. And I had the fortune of reading this article about the history of kanji and how, like in early times, a symbol for, I'm going to be making this up, but this is what I gleaned from it, and I think it's fairly truthful. But say a symbol for a house, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, if a Westerner came along and looked at that, they'd go like, yeah, I think that might mean house. And if they didn't know, they were a little perplexed by it, and then the Japanese person says, yes, this symbol means house, then you'd go like, oh yeah, I see house there for sure. I totally get it. Well, that's that symbolism, or that kanji, early um, pictograms in a sense, that told language, the story of language, evolved. And let's just say, and again, I don't remember the truth to this, but about every 100 years or something, a new emperor started thinking about the language as it existed and said, you know what? I want to revise and reinvigorate the language and redesign it. And of course, we've done that with lettering in this country or in the Western world as well. Redesign proportional letters, et cetera, et cetera. But so that revision of kanji now became more abstract and less understandable by a layperson or a non-Japanese person. And that happened about 4 or 5 times, to where it went from being understandable, literal, to a much more abstract level. However, it always grew out of the real meaning or the literal meaning, and maybe even the literal image of it in the beginning. So that's what abstraction should be. It is pulling away from a model that is constant and real. And as we pull away from it, we abstract, but we don't forget its origins. It's always being related to that model, so that it has power and gravity, even though it is different. So, without ever wanting, I never looked at kanji language as it exists currently at all and tried to mimic it at all, but I was just trying to create compositions that exceeded just a decorative construct, and have them have a sense of weight and measure or gravity and meaning that kanji of today does, because of its connection and its origins. Now, I can't do that because mine don't relate to any historical precedent or truth. So the fear I have about them, and always have had and still carry to some extent, although it hasn't stopped me from making it, is that these are nothing but decorative works, and they are based on composition. Now, the weakness of composition, many feel, is that composition is not an idea. Composition is various parts and pieces and colors and shapes and etc. The things that constitute art put together in certain way to create a pleasing composition. They also, it's composition super important to painting in building the story, and that's a different kind of composition. But we think in terms of abstract art, sometimes composition is nothing more than interior decoration. You can have a nice, simple, beautifully painted room, nice wood floors, and now you have a couch, 2 chairs, coffee table, a couple lamps, and whatever. And you begin to move them about the room and create a presentation or a position of those elements in a way that you think is handsome. And you do it. And then 3 months later, you go, you know what, I think I'll change this room a little bit. And you could literally probably put those same elements in that room, the same exact elements, same exact room, 50 different ways that are pleasant. However, it is possible for a very, very astute eye and person to maybe put them in a way together, in a way in that room that exceeds all the others, and that has some kind of extraordinary capacity and beauty that exceeds what the others were doing, which were fairly common to each other. So anyway, that's what I've tried to do building those things, is to create an interesting, I hate to use the word, but interesting composition that holds the viewer and gives the viewer an experience in an abstract kind of geometric, somewhat architectural space, and between positive and negative forms. And as I said, I've made them very large to start with. I've made them down to 8 inches by 8 inches. I've made them every size in between. I've done them with dry surfaces, wood fired, highly polychromatic colored ones. And I mean, I have I've done so many, and the funny thing is they never were very popular. When I want to do something, I do it regardless of whether I think it will ever sell or not. But they were, once again, because they're more abstract, and the figure is much more popular in regards to my work. But I explored them a lot, and I'll probably go back to them at some point. Low fire glazes that are sandblasted, so they feel like a pure yellow mineral or pure red mineral or whatever. And of course, they're very different than, the wood fired ones you have a couple of there. You will. Um, yeah, so that's kind of what all that was about. And they were all extruded clay bars or tubes. And there's something kind of, it's like building those coils into grid forms way back in grad school. There's a pleasure in the making of them too. Um, so, yeah. Next on my agenda, I don't even know. I don't know. I don't know that I've ever known. I No, I've never known. I I don't think that far ahead. I mean, of course, there's sometimes where, um, you know, like for a long time, there's the desire to make some really big baskets, and I didn't do it, and I didn't do it, and relates to what I was talking about earlier. And then all of a sudden, just before, it was only like 2 months before a show was coming up at Bronstein, I went and bought a bunch of basketry materials, and I started weaving these baskets, into and onto, and as part of my wood sculptures. And like I had never done that before, and I start just a few months before the show's going up, and um, so there was a case where I had this desire, and I finally kind of did it. But I don't, I don't really have, in general. No, I never quite know where the hell I'm going, really. Yeah, I mean, it's almost easier to talk about um, what I don't want to do than it is what I want to do. And part of me, for quite a while here, has wanted to, um, I don't know, with the wood, I don't want to say take a break from the figure, but maybe approach it in a different way. And I don't know how to do that yet. And so that's something I'm thinking about. And that I probably shouldn't share. That's kind of a vulnerable kind of thing that people like to think people like me don't grapple with. But that's being considered. And as you may know, I mean, I started as a potter. I stated that, and when I started into graduate school at Davis, I pretty much gave up making pottery for any personal reasons after that. And when I taught at the university, I taught wheel throwing and advanced pottery throwing and glaze calculation, stuff like that for 30 years. So I did demos all the time. I worked with my advanced students, got in the trenches with them, did all the projects I gave them. I did them as well. And I always enjoyed that. And my wife, Sandy Simon, is a peer potter, and she's connected with some of the greatest potters that she went to school with, and Warren McKenzie. And through her, over the last 40 years that I've been with her, 38 years, I've met all those potters, and I admire their work. And between Sandy and them, it enthused me when I quit working with clay, at least temporarily, and started working with wood, which surprised me. And that's a whole story in itself that's kind of interesting, but it's quite interesting. And it was a big deal for me. Um, I, I soon started missing clay as a substance. And I think about it and I think, this wood is so perfect for my figuration. I don't want to go back and make clay figures anymore, unless they're small scale, which I did. So all of a sudden I thought, you know what? I'm going to start making some pots again. And I'm going to try to make them better than I ever knew how to make them way back when, because I've seen more in life and seen more great pots and all that. And I started making pottery, and that was like literally almost 30 years ago. So, in addition to doing wood sculpture and clay sculpture, I stop and make pots at least 2 times a year, and I make like a full kiln load or whatever. Like, and I've got a couple of big kilns. So um, I do soda firing, I do conventional high fire gas, sometimes wood fire, but um, and I absolutely love making pots. I mean, and if I get a really good pot out, and I've always said this isn't something new to me, but just a beautiful cup or a beautiful bowl is as good as anything I've ever made out of any media, no matter the scale, whatever. When it's when it's good or beautiful, it's just good and beautiful, period. So I get a lot of satisfaction from that. And so to answer your question, once in a while I kind of think about spending even more time making pottery because I love it. And besides that, there's something kind of wonderfully honest about pottery. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. Um, and I only care about pottery that is functional. I do not like pottery that is kind of functional, but been bastardized by invention or whatever, and made basically unfunctional or non-functional because of those things. I don't care for that. Either make sculpture or make a pot that you can drink out of or eat out of. And anyway, so I sometimes think about spending even more time doing that. And I like, again, about the honesty part, I love the fact that it's a pot. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to, figure out what genre it fits into. I mean, of course, they fit stylistically into different slots, maybe. But I don't know, beyond that, how to answer your question. I don't have any big projects come up. I have no commissions coming up. Um, I know that I'm out here in Minnesota and I don't have a real studio here. I work outdoors and I haven't done that yet. I just had a solo show go up the day I left California 6 weeks ago. And I'd worked for about 7 months straight and I look forward to a break. So I've been working on this cabin we have out here, improving it and doing a lot of work on it. And I'm at that point where I'm done doing the projects on that and I want to get to making some artwork. And I don't even know what that's going to be. I've got some ideas. Um, but, you know, I mean, I'm apt to like start casting cement or something. I've been thinking about some kind of totemic cement pieces that are made, having, made molds to form them in. But, will I do it? I don't know. And there's a lot of stuff ruminating, kicking around in my mind right now, but I don't know.